Hi, everyone, and welcome to an April APR month presentation on research. This bit.ly will take you to the slides without any recording or narration. If you'd like to go there to move around and click, feel free. A little bit of background of how this presentation came to be. The APR chair requested that Nashville chapter APRs discuss and showcase the use of research in PR with examples. And Carrie Guyton and I were talking about doing this, and then COVID-19 happened, so we shifted to a recorded presentation. So today we're going to cover the basics of RPIE, where and how research fits, some examples, and some resources. I suggest a pen and paper because there's a couple points in here where I'll have a little timer for you to do a couple of exercises, and you might want to jot some ideas down. The timer has music, so you might want to set your sound to about 20 so that it's not too loud when that happens. So a little bit about me. My name is Sharee LeBlanc Broussard. I'm a native of Louisiana, lived in Alabama for about half my life. I spent 12 years as a practitioner, and of those, most were in management. 15 years as a faculty member at Spring Hill College in Mobile. 8 of those were as an administrator and special projects leader for campus. I did part-time project work and consulting for almost 20 years. I was accredited in 2005. I received my doctorate in 2009 from the University of Southern Mississippi. I've done multiple applied and basic research projects, and I joined the Belmont faculty in August of 19 when my husband and I relocated to the Nashville area. I have 2 email addresses there, shareebroussard@belmont.edu or shareebroussard@gmail.com. One has a dot, the other doesn't. So where to begin? Of course, we begin at the beginning because it's a very good place to start. RPIE, the 4-step process of public relations: research, plan, implement, and evaluation of programs. So it represents about a third of the exam, and it's important that it become inherent to all that you do. So the R, research, is really in all 4 parts of the process. So what I'd like you to do up front is think about where and how research can fit into each step of the process. How does research fit in research, in planning, and implementation and evaluation? And I'll give you 1 minute to jot down a few ideas. Great. I hope you guys had at least a couple of things written down for each one, or thought through a couple of things for each one, but I'll go over a couple of places, a couple of things that rest in each place. So in the research part of RPIE, first thing you need to figure out is, who do you want to reach? What do you want them to think, feel, or do? What do they currently think, feel, or do? What messages are you going to want to develop, and why? What are the outcomes you're trying to reach? So those are some of the things that would fall into the research part of RPIE. In the planning part of RPIE, things about how, when, where, why, and by whom will things happen, how much will they cost, etc. All that stuff falls into the planning part. And we know you don't just know what things cost and how to make them happen. You have to figure it out in a lot of cases. And so research is involved in planning. In the implementation part, research is involved because monitoring and, how is it progressing? Are there any changes needed in the program, etc. And then in the evaluation part, have you achieved the results you said you were going to achieve? Were you successful? Why or why not? So all research exists in all parts of RPIE, and it lives in the context of measurement and evaluation of the programs and campaigns that we do. So if you're not familiar with the Barcelona Declaration of Measurement Principles, it attempts to standardize measurement and evaluation internationally for communication practitioners. So back in 2010, a group gathered in Barcelona to hammer out what are the international standards for measurement and evaluation. And it was a multi-year process even to get to that point. They determined 7 standards, and then they gathered again in 2015 to refine those standards. So this is Barcelona Declaration of Principles 2.0. And the 7 international standards of measurement and evaluation are, number 1, that goal setting and measurement are fundamental to communication and public relations. 2, that measuring communication outcomes is recommended versus measuring outputs. 3, the effect on organizational performance can and should be measured where possible. 4, measurement and evaluation require both qualitative and quantitative methods. 5, add value equivalency is not the value of communication. We know there folks still practice that way, where in trying to affirm value for clients, they'll say, well, you receive this many inches or this in print or this many minutes in airtime. And so if you were to have paid for that, it would have cost you this, but it was free. Well, nothing's free. It's earned media. And, it costs time and it costs effort and a whole lot of other things. And so AVEs are discouraged as being a value of communication because there's so many more rich ways to measure success, namely in outcomes that have grown from the communication efforts. Number 6 is that social media can and should be measured consistently with other channels. And number 7 is that measurement and evaluation should be transparent, consistent, and valid. So these are the internationally expressed standards for measurement and evaluation of communication and public relations activities. The 4-step process is inherent in all of this. So if you were to click the link for the infographic and article, it would take you to a PR News article that has this infographic and a little more explanation if you'd like to go there. If you click on the link that says click for AMEC framework, it's going to take you to the framework that shows you information about inputs and outputs and outtakes and outcomes, etc. And so I'm not going to click through all of those things because it would take too much time, but I will click on this, the AMEC taxonomy. AMEC is the Association for the Measurement of and Evaluation of Communication, and taxonomy is a word representing how we name things, what we call them. So this is common language regarding the standards. And so if you go through here, it explains how this came to be and how to use it. And like I said, the AMEC framework is inherent in this taxonomy. So what it's saying in the framework is that you've got inputs, which are things you need to do to prepare for the communication, your activities, the things you actually produce. Your outputs is what is received by your target publics. Your outtakes is what they walk away with, and your outcomes are the effects that your communication has on its publics, and then the impacts are the result of the communication activities. And so that's the basic framework. And then you'll see the steps in there of what this actually references and example metrics and milestones. So for example, if you want to measure an outtake of advocacy, you could look at things related to message acceptance, trust levels, trying things, expressing a brand preference, etc. So ways you can determine whether your outcome of advocacy has been achieved would be through social media analysis, some data statistics, ethnography or netnography, which is ethnography online, polls, surveys, focus groups, interviews, etc., net promoter scores. So this gives you what we do, what you're trying to aim for, how you measure it, and what things you can examine in order to determine whether or not it's been achieved. This is gold right here. It's not hard to use. It takes a little time to figure out the navigation and all the different parts and pieces of this website. But what the AMAC framework does in this taxonomy and other resources, it helps you to be thinking granularly at some points about how will I measure and evaluate all the things that I'm doing. Because one of the things I'll say to students is we don't just do stuff, right? We're trying to cause things to happen. And so by doing that, we have to measure whether or not they did happen. So measurement and evaluation are inherent to research as it exists within the RPIE process. A few basic ideas regarding research in general within PR. We never just do research for no reason. Research and information, not just data, exist to help us make better business decisions. So we don't just do it, we do it for a reason. And it's important to remember that you always begin with what you have. What can you get your hands on fairly easily? What kind of key performance indicators do you have? What kind of metrics do you have? How are you judged now? What materials do you have? What resources do you have? What information do you have in your archives? Always begin with what you have. Then you determine what you need. Then you progress to what you can find. And then finally, you would conduct primary research as necessary. So if you think back to the taxonomy and the metrics that I showed you, a lot of those things were existing data points that you can use to inform better business decisions. So if you look at the APR study guide, it talks about important classifications of research. And I'll go into them a little bit, but what they are primary and secondary research, applied and basic research, qualitative and quantitative research, formal and informal research. And when you're looking at these and thinking about classifications, you're really just thinking about what's being done, how is it being done, and can it be repeated? So I'm going to jump into this on the primary and secondary part. So primary research is anything you do yourself, anything you gather yourself, anything you conduct yourself, any research that you do yourself is primary. Secondary research is anything you're looking up. So, for example, if you go to find government resources, it was primary for the government agency, but it's secondary as you're looking it up. It was primary for the academic researcher who did it, but it's secondary when you're looking it up. And then if it's something you're doing yourself, it's primary. If it's something you look up, it's secondary. And the key to secondary research is source quality. And I like to say, does it have a high percentage of cacao? Not chocolate, but it's an acronym for, is it current, accurate, credible, authoritative, and objective? It's an easy way to judge whether a source is of high quality or not. So the highest quality sources are scholarly, peer-reviewed sources. And right behind that is some of the trade references, some of the trade publications. So for example, you can have an academic study about I don't know, some form of consumer behavior activity. And then within, a few months, it'll show up in, marketing news or PR news or Adweek as a recent study found, right? So that's an example of, you've got the scholarly, academic, peer-reviewed type of source, often appears in trade. Other than that, trade sources will have some research reports. Internet Advertising Bureau does a lot of that, etc. So just be careful on trade because a lot of folks try to set themselves up as thought leaders and share information on the web. And so you have to make sure that if you're going to use some source, that it is a quality source. These types of things are accessible far beyond Google. So Google is a big part of it. Google's our friend, but Google is not it. So Google Scholar has a little bit more, a deeper type of articles and information than just plain Google. And then libraries at your disposal have a lot of great resources. They subscribe to databases that, would typically be paywalls for most people. So it's fairly easy. You can go to public libraries, or most colleges and universities will allow a guest visit to their library to use their databases and such. But so libraries are an essential tool to secondary research. Another thing is to look for aggregate information. So one example of that is, there'll be indexes and different things, but one example of an aggregate resource is a series called the Marketing Scales Handbooks, and there are 10 of them. And I'll click here to show you this website where it aggregates a lot of that data, and I'll tell you what it is. So the Marketing Scales Handbooks, there are 10 of them now, and they're published by Dr. Bruner, and he's had assorted colleagues over the years. But what they do is they go through all published articles within a time span related to marketing, advertising, consumer behavior, etc. And they pull out the scales. The scales meaning the questions that are used in this research. And then they give the statistics on the scales indicating reliability, validity. They give a little information on the history, where it was published, and that sort of thing. This is gold. You can a day pass to this site is like $39, I think, but the books are each over $100, and they're very worth it. So the reason I show you this is to tell you that sometimes these aggregate sources are just tremendously valuable. Like say you have to create a survey, well, you wouldn't just start from scratch and make your own questions when you can go to something like Marketing Scales and they exist. You just need to find them. Let's say you wanna measure attitude toward the brand. Well, there are scales for that. You want to measure purchase intent. There are scales for that. You want to measure brand quality. There are scales for that. You can look up things that have already been done that'll save you a lot of time and energy, and not have to have you start from scratch. Another place for secondary research is government sources, and the federal government is probably the biggest researcher in the world, but there's so much available at our disposal. The Census Bureau does not just count people every 10 years. The Census Bureau is always studying the population, program participation, mental health, drug use, just anything you can possibly think of. The census studies it related to the population of the United States of America. And so there's tons of data available by metro, geographic regions, by programs, by almost any sorting point you can think of. So the Census Bureau is a tremendous resource, and one of the cool things they have are these data visualizations. I'm going to show you that. It gives you an idea of just about anything that you want to know. The Census Bureau has the information on it, and there's often a visualization of it. You can access the reports, you can do research, you can find these infographics and information, and it's just tremendously helpful. So the Census Bureau is a very valuable resource. The Bureau of Labor Statistics studies everything related to employment, employees, volunteering even. The census has a lot of information about volunteering. And the USDA, I'm going to click on that one just to show you an example of some of what they do. So the United States Department of Agriculture studies a lot of things related to consumer behavior. And so there's tons of information at your disposal through this, and not just related to like program participation, but the kinds of things people are doing, like dietary and behavioral indicators such as diet quality, foods available, frequency of eating out, etc. I mean, there's just so much there related to consumer behavior. So don't think that whatever it is you're trying to find doesn't exist. It's just a matter of finding where it is, because a lot of times what people think they might need to do research on, they don't. They could just look it up. So I did want to show you a couple more things on secondary. So think tanks are valuable. You have to be careful, though, to know what you're dealing with those organizations. Do they have a political stance, and how do they lean, etc. So one that I love is Pew Research. I use it a lot. Pew Research studies just about anything you can think of. Um, so politics, religion, internet, technology, science, etc., social trends, it studies a lot of it. So there's information that exists. Not everything is politics on this site as well. So it's just a lot of good, solid information that's well researched and can provide good background for you for anything you need to know. Another thing that I like to keep an eye on is Nielsen Insights. So Nielsen, y'all know them as the they track TV ratings and things like that. But Nielsen does a lot of data work, and they publish these insights on a regular basis, and they cover all of this stuff, things related to demographics, digital, media, markets, finances, all of this. So there's a lot of information out there through Nielsen, and a lot of times folks don't think about that organization. One cool thing they do is periodically they'll publish this media universe that shows what people are doing with media in the US. And so it breaks it down. And the cool thing about this is that they have several of them, and so you can see changes over time and how now most things are not regular television anymore. It's a lot of the streaming services and such. But this will give you the numbers behind that kind of information. So I think it's super useful. And but the point being, I could show you things all day long. Oh, look, here's another one. Urban Institute is one I like to use, things related to nonprofits. So the National Center for Charitable Statistics is what this is, and it gives you a lot of information about nonprofits and things in the nonprofit sector. And it also links to state nonprofit organizations. So that's super helpful as well. But like I said, I could spend days just showing different resources and places to go to look things up. But primary is research you do yourself, secondary is research you look up, and there's so much more than Google. So much more than Google. So make sure you're keeping an eye on source quality, high percentage of cacao, current, accurate, credible, authoritative, and objective. Another distinction of research is applied versus basic research. Basic research is generally shared. It's research on big questions for general purposes. So you can think of that as like academic or scholarly peer-reviewed research. The applied research is mostly proprietary and it's for a very specific purpose, like specific organization, specific trade association, etc. So it's very focused. Where basic is general and shared, applied is generally focused and not shared. Qualitative and quantitative is another huge distinction in research, and qualitative represents rich data, it's deeper data, it gives you insights, and people share thoughts and feelings, and it's just a lot richer. Smaller sample sizes. Think of qualitative would be interviewing. So very small. You're not going to interview, 500 people. You're going to interview a few people, glean some key points, and then take that and use it for something else. So uh, qualitative data is often done first because you can get started with it fairly quickly and easily. But a lot of times it helps to plan quantitative. Sometimes quantitative helps inform qualitative. They work together. Neither is better than the other, but they do have their distinction. So qualitative is rich data, smaller samples. It's often done first. It's very time consuming. If you're doing one interview here or there, that's not the case. But if you're doing a series of focus groups, if you're doing ethnography, there's a lot of things that are just really time consuming about qualitative research. Transcribing all the conversations, looking for the themes, analyzing the results of the information that you're getting. It takes time. So qualitative and then quantitative is hard data. So if you think of anything you can reduce to numbers is quantitative research. So you can have a variable with two categories of male and female. You would take that and it would become 1 and 2 for statistical analysis. So quantitative's hard data, qualitative's rich data. You're going to have larger samples for quantitative data. It's often done second. The participants don't really have or give much time to it, and it's pretty low commitment, whereas qualitative's higher commitment. And quantitative can be quick. So with a quantitative, if you know what scales you're going to be using and things like that, you can conceivably start to finish conduct a quantitative study in a couple weeks, whereas an in-depth qualitative study will take a few months. So, but this is a primary distinction, and both are useful and they often inform one another, and neither is better than the other. Another distinction in research is whether it's formal or informal. So formal research, you think of it as following a rigorous scientific method. So it's very self-correcting, it's systematized, you define the purpose, you review the literature, you develop your hypothesis, determine your method, gather your data, analyze the results, disclose the limitations, and develop your conclusion, including management implications. The key to formal research is that it is replicable. So conceivably, you can conduct a study following rigorous scientific method, and someone could take what you've written up and redo the study and get just about the same results as you. So that's a key to formal research. It follows rigorous scientific method and it is replicable. So examples would be polls or surveys and experiments. So most people think of experiments, they think of labs and controlled situations. You can do experiments on the internet with questionnaires and etc. The key to what makes something an experiment is the manipulation of variables. You have control variable and you have manipulated variables. So that's an explanation of formal research. And then informal research is all the other methods of research. So it will follow a system, but informal research is not replicable. So examples of informal research are any type of interview, including focus groups, forums, community forums, audits, historical research, media analysis, because any factor could change the event so that it won't happen the exact same way another time. That's what makes something informal. It's not bad. It's just what it is. And so when you're talking about research, you always have to explain what was done and what its limitations were. Some forms of research can either be formal or informal depending on how they're done. So things like content analysis and social media research, we think of social listening and social media monitoring or netnography. Those things can be either formal or informal depending on how they're done. So whether quantitative or qualitative, formal or informal, primary or secondary, basic or applied, research should be well-planned, systematic, and transparent. So when you're presenting the information, generally you're going to present what you needed to know and why, what did you do to gather the data, who are the participants, what did you find out, what were the shortcomings of the study, and what can you do with the information. So it's very important to remember that the APR exam is about application, not memorization. So there's not any situations where it's, here's this definition, tell me what this term is. That's not how the test works. It's all about application. So your job as a candidate, learn the terms and principles, seek out the examples, apply the knowledge that you're getting along the way. That's why it's an APR journey. And then practice and engage with whatever principle you're working on at that point in time, and then you want to try to pull them all together. So again, application, not memorization. So I'm going to go over a few common methodologies and some of the keys to those. So generally in PR we do a lot of these four methodologies. So observation, focus groups, content analysis, and surveys or polls. So observation, we do it all the time. Whether we're watching traffic patterns at an event, we're just looking at how many people have come to something, how much money has been donated to something. Those are observational kinds of stats. Analytics are observational. You can conceivably do more with them, but they are basically just telling you who's come to your site, how long have they stayed there, what clicks did they hit, what did they buy, that type of thing. So observation is inherent to the things that we do. Focus groups are another thing that is pretty common in the field. And what they are is a group interview. They're designed to provide insight into some problem or opportunity you're trying to solve. They are never, ever replicable because any slight factor like temperature in the room, or a person has a headache, or someone's grumpy, any slight factor can change the synergy and the group dynamic. And so they provide insight, but they're not replicable. So key to a focus group is a very well-planned facilitator's guide that covers everything from, how you're going to determine the participants, what materials are needed, where you're going to have it, who's going to transcribe, who's going to facilitate, what questions are going to be asked, how the data is going to be analyzed. All of that is planned out up front. The focus group is conducted. The facilitator hopefully has a lot of finesse in dealing with people and can pull information from quiet people and kind of lessen the participation subtly of some folks who could be overbearing, etc. So you want to make sure everyone is heard and that they're sharing because your goal is to get insight, it's to get deep, rich data. So mostly you're going to ask open-ended questions. The participants are going to be very carefully selected so that they match whatever population you're trying to study. So let's say you're trying to study females between 25 and 35. Well, every member of that focus group is going to be a female between 25 and 35. And then within that, there'll be other variables that you can determine. So mostly the questions are open-ended. Sometimes they'll have a worksheet in front of folks where they'll ask them to write something down, like or to scale something or rate something. And one of the reasons for that is to get the person thinking about something before they start sharing it. So if you ever do something like that, you'll need to pick up the sheets of paper that the folks write on, and you also need to, of course, record the entire event, transcribe the entire event, conduct a thematic analysis on what's being said, and analyze that in the context of what you wanted to know. If you're going to do one focus group, you've pretty much not done anything other than talk to a few people. So you want to make sure that if you're going to do a focus group methodology, you have to have at least 2 sessions. So you're going to have 2 sets of participants with the same questions, the same everything set up in the facilitator's guide, but you can have 2 different sets of respondents. And then you compare their 2 responses, and then somewhere in there is the combination of the 2 provides you with the information rather than just data. So 8 to 12 participants is ideal and common. I've seen some things that say you can go down as low as 5, and then I've seen some things that say you can go over 20. That's a lot to handle, and too few people, you lose that synergy. So you want to make sure you have at least 2 focus groups on whatever thing you're trying to tackle, and that you try to hit between 8 and 10 people within that group who represent the population you're trying to study exactly, and they're sorted on the key variables that or in ranked order. So that's a little bit about focus group methodology. Content analysis methodology, a lot of the social listening tools use this behind the scenes, but content analysis, when humans do it, you determine you determine what you're going to analyze, you define categories, you have 2 coders that work independently, and they code whatever they're studying based on those categories, and then you determine the intercoder reliability. And that could be as simple as a simple percentage agreement all the way to something more complex, like there's a statistic called Krippendorf's kappa that allows you to analyze intercoder reliability at a higher level. So what you're looking for is emergent themes in the context of whatever it is you're trying to study. So content analysis still works, and it's still being done. And in fact, it's done a lot in analytic software. social listening tools and things of that nature. So another one that we can talk about today is surveys and polls. So we know these take lots of different forms, from paper and pen to, in-person intercept surveys, maybe a tablet, maybe a paper and pen and a clipboard, online surveys, interviews that the person will, I mean, there's just a lot of forms that this could take. So a few things about this is that the question type can vary. So once you determine the problem you're trying to solve, the need for a survey, you're going to have questions that will, you're going to design your instrument so that it addresses the problem you're trying to solve. So the questions you can use you can use open-ended questions where they have like a free response, yes/no questions, multiple choice questions, ranking questions, agreement questions that we're familiar with in the Likert type scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. There are questions that'll ask people how much or how many hours do you spend online each day, things like that. There's something called a semantic differential question where you have two different polar opposite terms on a scale that's 7 points at least, and then the person can code where their thoughts on whatever topic fall within those two polar opposite terms. So you want to try to have scales that give you the opportunity to finesse the data. So if you have, like, say you have a 3-point scale, good, better, best, there's not that rich, below average, average, above average, it's not extremely rich. But if you have a 9-point scale, that's on one side below average and on the other side it's above average. Within those 9 points, you've got a lot of flexibility of response, and so you can determine nuances that way. So the more you don't want to have scales with too few data points. You want to have scales that allow you to really see how data would be dispersed. So let's see. Oh, when you're putting your instrument together, it's very important that if it's a closed-ended question, potential responses must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive, which means that there's no replication between them and all potential answers are accounted for. So, for example, you'll see this a lot where someone wants to know age and they'll give ranges. And so they'll say 18 to 29, 29 to 39. Well, how do you answer that if you're 29? You can be a young 29 or you can be an old 29. So you have to make sure that every single potential answer lives in one place and that all potential answers are accounted for. So for age in the range example, you would say 18 to 29, 30 to 39. You don't overlap at all. And then the exhaustive point means that every potential response is there. And so that's why a lot of times you'll see in closed-ended questions, there's an other and allows people to write in. So by doing so, you allow all potential responses to be considered. But you're estimating that most responses will be in X, Y, and Z. And so you give them X, Y, and Z, but then you allow them to say, A beyond that. So another big important thing is that your questions, especially scale questions, should point to what you want to know. So you're not ever going to have one question that is about one thing, and then that's it. It's all you need on that one topic. So you're going to have generally 3, sometimes more, potential answers that will point to the thing you want to know. So for example, here I have the concept of brand equity and 3 potential questions related to that, which comes from the Marketing Scales Handbook, are, I've had mostly positive experiences with X, I value X, I like X. So those 3 things together would point to brand equity. So if someone really likes an organization, it's the responses are going to be positive on all 3 of these questions. And you see how they're numbered 1, 6, and 10. So that means you would mix in other scales from 2 to 5 and 7 to 9, so that you're you've got maybe 3 questions pointing to brand equity, you've got maybe 3 questions pointing to familiarity, whatever things you're trying to find out, you're pointing to them. You're not just asking point blank one time and then moving on to something else. So another good thing about when you're putting your questions together, there's nothing wrong with looking at what's already been done. I've talked about the Marketing Scales Handbook. I'm going to show you some communication life cycle metrics in the resources, but there's nothing wrong with looking at how does the Census Bureau collect data on age? What are their categories? And then using those same categories. Okay, so we talked about some of the common methodologies for doing research, and we talked about common metrics based in measurement and evaluation. So this slide covers some of the keys to the common methodologies specifically related to quantitative data. So it's very important to note that data type matters, statistic selection matters, sampling matters, validity and reliability matter. So when you're dealing with data, there exists an order to the types of data that you're dealing with or can be dealing with. Nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, which spells the French word noir. That's an easy way to keep it straight. Nominal are the lowest levels of data, and ratio is the highest level of data. Nominal variables are nothing but naming variables. If you think numbers on a football jersey, changing yes, no to 1, 2, just naming variables. Ordinal variables are ranking variables, first, second, third. So if you think of ordinal, there's no supposition that the points between the data are equal. One way I like to think about that is like a fourth grade class. You know, some people are growing way faster than others, and so if you line up a fourth grade class from tallest to shortest, you're going to have a very wonky line because you've got some really tall people, some really short people, and little clusters within the grouping between those two extremes. And so that's ordinal. There's definite order, but it's not there's not equidistance between the points. Scale data, which is interval and ratio, those are definite points with equal distance. And the difference between them is that interval does not have a 0 point and ratio has a 0 point. So if you think interval, a good example of that is temperature. You know, there's a distinct difference between 99 degrees and 100 degrees, but 0 degrees doesn't mean anything because it goes below 0. And then ratio data is, you know, distinct points, equidistance, but a true 0. So an example of ratio would be weight, age. If you enter it as a numeral, not age in a ranking sense, then it would be handled as ordinal. So data type matters and statistics selection matters. You can only do certain things with certain types of data. You can't add up 2 players' numbers on their football jerseys divided by 2 and have that number mean anything because nominal data is just naming data. So you can do more things with higher level data. And statistics selection depends upon what type of data you have. So a person can tell the computer or can program Excel to run statistics on data that can't handle that, and that's not a good place to be. So we need to know what certain levels of data can do. So you can you're limited in what you can run with nominal data, and there's so much more you can do with higher level data. So it's important to know that data type matters and statistics selection matters. One thing to note is that when you're reporting averages of scales, that a lot of times folks will just report the mean, and just reporting the mean isn't quite enough because you're not seeing anything else but the mathematical average. And so you want to look at the very least when you report a mean, you want to look at standard deviation as well because it lets you know how spread out or close together the data is or the responses are. So for example, if you have 2 schools and school A outscores school B on a standardized test, but if you just look at the aggregate score, then you would think school A is a better school. But if you look at the data and how it's distributed, you'll see maybe school A had a few people who scored really high, very few people who scored low, and then most folks were in the middle. But school B had most people scoring about the same, with maybe one really high score and one not so low score. And so if you look at how the data spread out, school B was actually stronger performing because school A had some outliers that pulled their aggregate score up. So, looking at how data is spread out is really important. And some of the statistics you can run on higher level data, you can do a lot with it. So descriptive data just describes what's there. Then with higher level data types and higher level statistics, you can do more than just describe. You can explain, you maybe explain why things are the way they are. You can predict maybe what will happen next, and even prescribe some future action that should happen as a result of your analysis of the data. So data type matters, and statistics selection matters. Sampling also matters. So there's a difference between a census and a sample. So a census is everyone in the population, and a sample is only some of the people in the population. So when you're sampling, the goal is that you're aligning to the population so that you're getting you're getting a good idea of how everyone would respond based on some people's responses. And there's the main differentiator for sampling is whether something is non-probability or probability. So if you have a non-probability sample, everyone in the population does not have an equal chance of being selected. So examples of that are convenient sample. Some folks call them accidental samples. They're the folks who happen to be available. And a lot of times convenient samples are just used to test your survey instrument. But a convenient sample is just who happens to be available. Self-selection, people choose to participate or not. Snowball sampling, where you'll find one or a couple people who represent who you want to study, and then they refer you to people like them. Purposive samples, that's where you choose people based on some very specific parameters. And that quota sampling is say you want to have X number of males, X number of females, or X number of boomers and Gen X and millennials, that type of thing. So quota sampling is a form of non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling is low level, and you really can't do much with that at all. And self-selection's pretty low as well. But some of these others, you can do more with them. But you just need to remember that folks in those kinds of samples don't represent the entire population. So you can discuss the results based upon the type of sample you have. Probability samples mean that when it's something's called probability, that everyone in the population has an equal chance of being included in the sample. So some examples of that are a simple random sample, systematic sampling, where you'll say every fifth person or every nth person. Stratified sampling is where you'll break the population into strata, and then you select from among those. And cluster sampling is when you know that you've got defined groups of people that match the population you're trying to study, and so you can go and you can select certain ones of those clusters to study rather than trying to study the entire population. So those kinds of things work well. If a probability sample, specifically if it's a random sample, there there's defined numbers of who you have to sample in order to get results that can be extrapolated to the population. So the number 384 is often referred to as a magic number because that's the sampling number for most populations, like city level, state level, etc. So it's 100,000 to 10 million. 384 will sample that. If you want to do the entire United States, most national polls are like 1,500 or 2,000 or 2,500 people. If you're doing a small population, let's say 1,200, you would have a sample size of about 300. And if you have a population of about 300, your sample size would be to something. If you have a population of 100, your sample size is like 99. So the difference is the larger the sample size, the larger the population, the smaller the sample size can be. The smaller the population, the larger the sample has to be. So if you have a really low population number, your best bet is to do a census and ask everyone in the population. So when we are doing sampling, there's always going to be margins of error. And so when folks are sampling, they're going to report the confidence level and the margin of error, which indicates that, based upon the way things were done, the precision of the study or the accuracy of the study, we're 95% confidence interval that what we found is what is in the population. And if this study would be repeated, we'd probably find the same results again. Margin of error it accounts for the mathematical flaws, so that so when you're reporting, or let's say you're looking at the results of a national poll and they're looking at political candidates and the poll results are like 2 points off, but the margin of error is 5%. And so that those two candidates are dead even statistically, but even though one may be higher than the other in the polling numbers. So margin of error is important, confidence level is important, probability, if you're sampling and you intend to extrapolate to an entire population, probability selection is important. And then if you're dealing with non-probabilities, generally that's okay as long as you really explain well what it is that you've done and who you're dealing with and what you intend to do with the data. So another important concept, or two more important concepts, are validity and reliability. And there's multiple ways to define both of these things, but validity measures what it's supposed to measure, and reliability reliability determines that it does it consistently. So these target graphs are really common ways to explain reliability and validity. Like you can have a really reliable test that doesn't measure what you're trying to measure at all. And you can have a test that measures what you're trying to measure, but it doesn't do so consistently. And then you can have instruments that don't do either one of those things. And then what you're shooting for, hence the target graphic, is that it's both reliable and valid, which means it's measuring what it's supposed to measure and it does so consistently. So if you think of things like the ACT and the SAT, those things are accepted measures of college readiness. People decide and make admissions decisions or scholarship decisions based upon those things because they consistently measure what they say they're going to measure, which is, college readiness or potential for success in college. Okay, so I know we've done a lot and we've talked a lot. So just let's think for a minute. Literally, I'm going to set the timer again for a minute. So let's say, based upon some of what we looked at, surveys and focus groups and observations and assorted other methodologies and keys to some of those methodologies. So let's say you're trying to gauge public support for moving an airport from one side of the city to another. What might you do? And how would you use the information to inform your activities? So we know something that big, you'd have to have community forums and public comment meetings and things of that nature. But what else would you do to gauge public support? So take a minute and jot down a couple of ideas, and I'll set the timer. Okay, so I hope that you came up with multiple ways to use these things or different types of ways of gathering data. So, content analysis, an example of that would be, look at media coverage, surveys. You can point blank ask people what they think about things in a manner that allows you to analyze the data. Focus groups would allow you to get to deeper, maybe some rationale behind people's feelings, that type of stuff. Of course, social listening, social media monitoring, observation, you can see how people are behaving online related to this topic. So there's lots of ways to handle things. And so what I'm going to do next is give you guys a couple of examples of some things that I worked on, because this was one of the points that we talked about when this presentation was being considered. So one example was a health department federal grant uh, uh, for a long-term campaign that was designed to encourage smoke-free public spaces. And this campaign, this project had, it was, well, first it was a federal grant, so there was a lot of defined parameters and specifics and monitoring about how things progressed. So there was a quantitative component uh, focused on the quit smoking phone lines, and there was some university research over the phone and web within the state and the county. And then the qualitative data was collected from just within the county. So it was mandated that there be 6 focus groups. And the 6 focus groups, the key sorting variable was non-smoking and smoking. So the 6 groups were all non-smokers. 4 were done during message development, and 2 were done during message distribution to determine people's receptance and their message absorption and that type of thing. So there was, again, a lot of monitoring, a lot of evaluation at the county level, state level, and federal level. And eventually what happened was, and was outside of the scope of the campaign when all of this was done, but during the campaign, several of the municipalities within the county adopted ordinance for smoke-free public spaces. And then within a year or so after, all of the municipalities within the county had done so. And so this was, it was interesting, and it was very timely and very tied to uh, a huge media buy. It was over $1 million media buy, and then there were a lot of PR activities that went along with that as well. So some of the lessons that I learned from this project were that sample selection and sorting on key variables to match the population are a key. And so what we did, we had screener questionnaires, and we distributed those in public spaces like the DMV, some civic gatherings, the courthouse, things where folks from every walk of life would be available to us. So we did the screener surveys, and then we sorted on key variables. And the number one variable, as I said, was smoking and non-smoking. And then we matched the population of the county in the focus groups using those screener questionnaires. Another important lesson I learned was one of those focus groups went up to 20 people, and that was just really hard to handle. So when the study guide talks about ideal numbers being 8 to 12, they are, because that's an easier to handle group. Another thing I learned from this one, I knew it, but the meticulous nature of a facilitator's guide. So especially for something like a federal grant where everything has to be approved in advance, the guide had to be very precise. Everything from the place, the food, how much you're paying the participants, every single question, how you're sorting, how you're going to analyze the data afterward. Everything had very, very meticulous. Open-ended questions and the follow-up questions all had to be spelled out. And then transcription, a valuable lesson on that one is that apps are great at transcribing recordings, but the human element never goes away. You still have to watch those videos over and over and compare the transcript, and then run analysis on the transcript for themes and then draft up the report. And so this was a very interesting project, and I loved it because it was tied very specifically um, to media and PR activities. And so this represented, in my estimation, like textbook examples of how do you do these types of things. And again, when you do the write-up, what you needed to know and why, what did you do, who were the participants, what did you find out, what were the shortcomings of the study, and what can you do with the data. So that's an example of a qualitative, informal um, research methodology tied to a campaign. And then here's another one, but this one's quantitative. So this one was uh, um, community perception of an organization study, and it was in preparation for a brand renewal campaign, and it was strictly online data collection. And some of the variables, and I've talked about these before because I've used them quite a bit, but familiarity with the organization, brand equity, organization, public relationship. There were more variables, but those were the ones that stand out. That study had 8 hypotheses. It had an academic component. It was a larger study because it was longer. It had more questions, and so it was it was a lot to pull this all together. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this one because this one was strictly purposive sampling. So we we didn't want the entire community. We wanted people who were engaged with the community to give us their perception of this organization. And so we sampled internally members and alumni of the organization, and then externally we sought out influential nonprofit boards of directors. Um, so within the community, the movers and shakers on several of the most prominent boards of directors. We went to the leadership program in the city, and we included all current participants and all alumni. We also looked at prospective members, and we did that with snowball sampling from the existing members. And each participant stream had its own coding so that we knew exactly where all of these surveys were coming from. We would still ask the people to clarify, who they were of these different types of folks we were sampling, but the stream coding also validated that in some way, because then we knew that if someone says they were a member, they had a code that showed that they were a member. So this was a really interesting study, and it gave us a good feel for that organization, and the information was used in a subsequent marketing campaign and brand renewal campaign for that organization. But we estimated we were going to reach about 4,300, and we actually reached 7,000 people, and we had 698 respondents. So we got a really good feel for what folks thought of this organization. In some ways, there were some other variables about comparing it to other organizations. So it was very interesting. We learned a lot. But I think some of my biggest takeaways were that sometimes you really just don't want everyone. You want to study the people you want to study. So when you do studies or research related to campaigns, then again, what did you need to know and why? What did you do? Who were the participants? What did you find out? What were the shortcomings of the study? And what can you do with the information that you gather? So why does research matter in the public relations process? The public relations process, the 4-step process of RPIE, is research-based and it's self-assessing. So in essence, once you set your objectives, you're judged against yourself. Did you do what you said you were going to do? Did you achieve what you said you were going to achieve? So research completely enables the measurement and evaluation processes, which are integral to high-level functioning. It matters because when you work research in and you're studying for the APR, you're beginning to practice in a manner that prepares you for the examination and beyond. All of these things elevate your knowledge, skills, and abilities. Your language becomes elevated, your practice becomes elevated. And when I say something about elevated language, one example of that is, if you're explaining to people how you got information for a project that you're doing, if you use something like, we conducted archival research to determine whatever sounds way better than you saying, I grabbed the file box and looked at what we did last year. So sometimes elevating the language leads to elevated thinking and elevated thinking about practicing, elevated practicing, and definitely elevated KSAs. When you have your APR, it means that you understand your profession at its highest levels, and research is inherent to that. Again, research enables measurement and evaluation, which are integral to RPIE. So whether it's do-it-yourself research, getting help for research, or hiring research, you have to have enough of an understanding of it so that you understand when and what and why and how. Um, Another reason it matters is because APR preparation and internalizing the RPI process are literally life-changing endeavors. You know, I call this an APR journey because it is a journey. You will be a changed person by the time you're done with it, and your practice will be different as you go through it and beyond. So I did want to talk about a few resources. You know about the APR bookshelf, and then there's on the short bookshelf, Don Stack's book, Primer of PR Research, is recommended, and it's a big book. It's got a lot of information in it, but it goes into all the details of how research works in the four-step process and beyond. And you all know the APR study guide. The Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communication, or AMEC, their materials, I I love them. They're not incorporated into the APR study guide, but I think that they're key to helping understand standards related to measurement and evaluation, and even wrapped around the PESO model. So AMEC is really good stuff because you saw in the taxonomy that it tells you, you know, what are you trying to measure, how you can measure it, and what do you need to look at to determine, um, you know, results based on that. I think it's super helpful. And there's the measurement maturity mapper. It's a new thing that, well, new's relative, but it allows you to go in and you can take it as a test, or you can take it to give them data on how people are measuring and track your own organization. So, like, you would fill it out for yourself, but um, if you do it as a test, the results don't feed their main database where they're trying to collect data on how organizations are using measurement and evaluation in their practice. I already talked about the marketing scales handbooks. Those are so helpful, and there's also the website, which I showed you. And those are helpful if you're in a situation where you have to do it yourself for research, where you can go and find scales or survey questions that already exist and adapt them to your own uses. And then the Institute for Public Relations, its helpfulness in preparing for the APR cannot be underscored, because what they attempt to do is um, bridge practice and academics. And so there's a lot of good information there. There's signature papers, there's some how-to information. There's just a lot of really good stuff there. So this first link is the research library, and it has so much in there, and it's broken down by category. So it's very helpful. The next two, Don Stacks and Shannon Bowen's Dictionary of Public Relations Measurement and Research, third edition. It's I doubt it's 50 pages long, but it's a glossary, it's information related to research and measurement, and then it also breaks down, like, it'll tell you what something is and tell you whether it's an output or an outcome, and gives you more information that way. And then this article by Walter Lindenman, it's a little bit older, 2001. Research doesn't have to put you in the poorhouse. Um, it's very good if you want to get a good background knowledge of some basic types of research you can do yourself. So it's an oldie but a goodie. Okay, when we talked about the marketing scales handbooks, these communication lifecycle metrics, they're from around 2012, but they're still on the IPR website. And if you look at these very carefully, like well, let me show you. I'll show you advocacy. So if you look at this, you'll see some of the same types of things related to the AMAC taxonomy, but you'll also see how to measure it. So let's say, the communication life cycle of advocacy, right, it describes what it is, and it talks about that it's an outcome metric, and then it talks about how you can gather this data and some of the questions you could actually ask to determine if someone is moving toward advocacy for your organization or if they're there. So there's the interviewer type questions and then the self-administered type questions. And it literally gives you cues for how to ask questions to measure these things. So each one of these in the communication lifecycle has an explanation, and it has example metrics of how you can determine that by asking people questions. So again, super helpful. Okay, so learning about these things, learning the principles, learning the terms, all of that is great. However, the idea is that you're able to put these into use. The APR exam is about application. So some of the best things that you can do to prepare are, is practice. You prepare by practicing. And so one way to practice is to ask yourself a lot of questions when you see things, or ask yourself questions related to your own organization. So if you were to think about a very specific problem or opportunity within your own organization or an organization with which you volunteer, break down how you would tackle it. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So what is the problem opportunity? And sometimes, honestly, that's one of the hardest questions to ask, because often a true problem can be masked by its symptoms. And so defining the problem or opportunity is huge. And then, why is it a problem? What do you know about the problem? What else do you need to know to make good decisions? What can you look up, which is secondary? What else would you need to gather, which is primary? From whom? Publics that you need to ask questions of. Why these participants? How can you reach them? That is a hard question to answer these days, because we know people don't answer the phone. So how are you going to reach them? What method are you going to use? What kinds of questions are you going to ask? Does each question point to something bigger and or serve a very distinct purpose? You don't need to ask questions about income if they're not important to whatever it is you're trying to find out. People don't like sharing those types of that type of data. How might you analyze the data you collect? And then what are you going to do with the data? How are you going to use it to inform your activities? We don't just collect data or do research for no reason. We do it to make better business decisions, to inform our practice as we move forward. And so the more you can practice, asking a lot of questions and answering them and trying to apply the principles and the terminology and the processes that you're learning, the better off you're going to be for the APR exam. And then this is some of the older guides. They had a lot of these practice activities that were called mental calisthenics. And so the idea being that you define, the problem or the opportunity, and then you ask yourself 5 W's and an H. What's happening? What's the source of concern? Where is it a concern? When is it a concern? Why is it a concern? Who it affects and how it affects them. So think about these kinds of things in context. What research could you do to determine the points of data you need to collect? And then how could the information you collect be used to inform your GHOST and your RPIE? Your goals, objectives, strategies, techniques. How is it going to all work? So the more you can practice, the better. Finally, best wishes for much success in your APR journey. This literally is a journey. It's life-changing. It will shape and shift your practice going forward. So my best advice is to prepare well, study, and practice what you're learning. Thank you very much.